There was something about late-night television that had always unsettled David Carter. He wasn't sure if it was the eerie quiet of an empty apartment, the glow of the screen against the darkness, or the way old infomercials seemed to echo through the stillness of the night. But this was different. This wasn't the usual late-night programming filled with reruns and static-filled commercials. This was something wrong. David had been aimlessly flipping through the channels at 2:47 a.m. when he found it. Channel 13. It shouldn't have existed. His cable package didn't include a Channel 13. As far as he knew, no one's did. But there it was, a faint, flickering signal barely pushing through the static. The screen showed a dimly lit room, the grainy black and white footage distorted by occasional bursts of interference. The only sound was a low, crackling hum. Then the screen cut to a figure, a woman. She sat in an old wooden chair, her back straight, her long hair hanging over her face. She didn't move. She didn't speak. David leaned forward, adjusting the volume. The static buzzed louder, but there was no other sound. No dialogue. No music. Just her. Then the screen glitched. For a split second, her head jerked up. Her eyes were black voids, gaping and bottomless. And just as quickly, the screen flickered again, returning to her still, motionless posture. David felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. He reached for his phone, snapping a quick photo of the screen. The moment the camera clicked, the TV shut off on its own. Silence. The only sound was his own breathing, suddenly uneven and shallow. A moment later, his phone buzzed. A new notification. He unlocked it with shaking hands. The photo he had taken was gone. In its place was a single text message. "Don't watch." David's stomach twisted. He didn't recognize the number. His hands trembled as he turned the TV back on. Static. No Channel 13. Had he imagined it? A late-night hallucination brought on by exhaustion? That message, someone had sent it. Someone knew. The next night, he couldn't help himself. He stayed up, waiting for 2:47 a.m. He flipped through the channels slowly, his heart pounding. Nothing. Then, flicker. Channel 13 reappeared. This time, the woman was standing. And she was closer. David's fascination had morphed into obsession. He scoured the internet, searching for any mention of Channel 13. There was nothing. No old urban legends. No archived television records. It was like it didn't exist. But he knew what he saw. And he wasn't alone. A deep dive into obscure forums led him to a small, hidden thread, buried in a forgotten corner of the dark web. The title made his blood run cold. Did you see her? The posts were dated years apart. Each one eerily similar. I found a channel that shouldn't exist. A woman in a chair. She watches me. She gets closer every time. One post stood out. The username was just a series of random numbers, but the message chilled David to the bone. If she moves, turn it off. Don't let her out. His mouth went dry. Let her out? The words echoed in his mind as he sat in front of the TV that night, fingers hovering over the remote. He shouldn't have looked again. He knew that now. But it was already too late. At 2:47 a.m., Channel 13 returned. The woman was standing right in front of the screen. And this time, she was smiling. David's breath caught in his throat. The woman on the screen stood impossibly close, her face mere inches from the camera. Her skin was wrong, too pale, almost translucent, like an old photograph faded by time. Her eyes remained those same gaping voids, deep and hollow, swallowing the dim glow of the static behind her. And that smile. It was too wide, stretched unnaturally across her face, like her mouth had been torn open and left that way. David's fingers trembled over the remote. Every instinct screamed at him to turn it off. To run. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a single, jittering motion, her head snapped sideways. The screen flickered. The static distorted. A garbled voice whispered beneath the interference, too low to understand. David's heart pounded. He turned up the volume. The whispering grew louder, warping and overlapping, like voices trapped in a loop. Then, through the chaos, he caught it, one clear sentence. I see you. The power in his apartment cut out. The TV died. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. David sat frozen, gripping the remote so tightly his knuckles ached. His own ragged breathing was the only sound. Then, a footstep. So deliberate. Inside his apartment. David's pulse thundered in his ears. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head toward the hallway. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. But something was there. Standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight glow filtering through his window. Something watching him. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything. But his body refused. He sat paralyzed, staring into the black void of his hallway. Then, his phone buzzed. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. David jerked violently, his trembling hands fumbling for the device. A new message. Unknown number, you shouldn't have looked. David sucked in a breath. His hands were so slick with sweat he nearly dropped the phone. Another buzz. A second message. Don't open the door. His stomach turned to ice. The knock came immediately after. So, rhythmic. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Right outside his apartment door. David's entire body locked up. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He could only sit there, shaking as the knocking continued. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number, she's outside. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. His gaze flickered toward the peephole. A part of him wanted to look, to know. But that voice in the back of his mind, the one screaming for survival, kept him rooted in place. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, his doorknob twisted. David snapped into action, scrambling to his feet and backing away. His pulse roared in his ears as the handle rattled violently, the old metal groaning under pressure. Something wanted in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. David stood frozen, his breath shallow. He didn't dare move. Seconds dragged into minutes. Then, his TV turned back on. The screen crackled to life, filling the dark apartment with its cold, flickering glow. Channel 13 was back. And this time, the woman wasn't on the screen. She was behind him. David spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing. But, nothing. The apartment was empty. No sign of anyone. His TV buzzed with static, filling the silence with an eerie, endless hum. He turned back toward the screen. His pulse hammered as his eyes searched the flickering image. The room on the broadcast was different now. Not the same dimly lit space as before. It was his apartment. David's breath caught. The camera angle was off-center, but there was no mistaking it. His couch, his coffee table, his TV stand. The image on the screen was live. Then, from the edge of the frame, something moved. David's stomach clenched. A figure stepped into view. The woman. Only now, she wasn't just staring at the camera. She was staring at him. David stumbled back. His lungs seized, his mind reeling. The woman tilted her head, her impossible smile stretching wider. Then, in a slow, jerking motion, she raised her hand and pointed. Not at the camera. At his closet. David's chest tightened. A cold sweat drenched his skin. He turned his head, barely able to breathe. The closet door was open just a crack. A sliver of blackness stared back at him. He hadn't left it open. His phone buzzed one final time. Unknown number, don't let her in. The closet door creaked. Something shifted inside. And then, to move. David couldn't move. His muscles locked, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, but he stood frozen, staring at the cracked open closet door. Something was inside. The TV screen still flickered with its distorted, live feed of his apartment. The woman remained on the screen, her dark, hollow eyes fixed on him, her eerie smile stretched impossibly wide. And her hand, her bony, withered hand, was still pointing. The closet. David's breath came in ragged gasps. The air in his apartment felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him. The closet door creaked again, just slightly. A hairline shift. David swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. But his gut told him otherwise. His fingers twitched around his phone. Slowly, with shaking hands, he raised it and typed out a message. "David, who are you? What do you mean don't let her in?" Seconds passed. No response. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stared at the glowing screen, waiting. Buzz. A reply. "Unknown number, it's too late." A sharp bang erupted from inside the closet. David jumped, his stomach twisting into knots. Something was in there. Something that shouldn't be. The TV's static grew louder, buzzing like a swarm of angry insects. He flicked his gaze back to the screen. The woman was gone. The feed still showed his apartment, still live, but now it was empty. David's blood ran cold. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. He could hear his own heartbeat, the soft hiss of the static, the distant hum of the city outside. A slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging down wood. Inside the closet, David staggered back. His knees felt weak. His breath hitched in his throat. The closet door began to inch open. David scrambled for the TV remote, his hands shaking violently. He pressed the power button, but the screen stayed on. More scratching. Closer. Louder. Then, from the darkness inside the closet, a whisper. "Let me in." David choked on a breath. The voice was soft, delicate, but wrong. Stretched and distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. His hands tightened into fists. "No, I won't." A hand emerged from the closet. Thin. Grayish. Elongated fingers stretching toward the dim light of the apartment. David acted on pure instinct. He lunged forward and slammed the closet door shut, throwing his entire weight against it. The second it closed, everything stopped. The scratching. The whispering. The static. Silence. David stayed pressed against the door, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven gasps. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, every muscle in his body coiled so tightly it hurt. The TV had gone dark. His phone was dead. The only sound left was his own, trembling breath. For what felt like an eternity, he didn't move. Then, ever so slowly, he stepped back from the closet, his eyes locked on it, waiting. No movement. No sound. It was over. Or so he thought. 2 nights later, David hadn't touched the TV since that night. He hadn't checked Channel 13. He hadn't searched for answers. He just wanted to forget. But the feeling never left. The feeling that something was watching. Lurking. Waiting. At night he heard things. A faint shuffling in the walls. A whisper at the edge of his hearing. The subtle, almost imperceptible creak of the closet door shifting on its hinges. And then, on the 3rd night, his phone buzzed. David's stomach twisted into knots. He had no unread messages. His phone had been dead since the night of the closet incident. But now it was on. A single notification blinked on the screen. A new message. "Unknown number, check the TV." David's hands clenched. His throat was dry. "I won't. I'm done." But the TV turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, crackling through the empty apartment. Then the image flickered. A new broadcast. David's blood ran cold. It was him. On the screen, he saw himself, sitting on his couch, staring at the TV, watching this exact moment. The camera angle was off. Slightly to the right, like it was being filmed from inside the closet. David turned his head slowly. The closet door was wide open. And inside, something moved. Something stepped out. The last thing David saw before the lights flickered and died was the woman, standing right behind him, smiling. David never screamed. He wanted to. His mind begged him to. But the air had been sucked from his lungs, his voice strangled before it could escape. He felt her presence behind him, felt it. A shadow that loomed too tall, too still. The cold air pressed against the back of his neck, like a breath that wasn't his own. The TV flickered. The broadcast still played. A live feed of him sitting on the couch, watching himself. But the camera angle had changed. Now it was closer. The perspective was all wrong, the image distorted. The grainy screen showed something else in the frame. A shape standing behind him. Slowly, painfully slowly, David turned his head. The woman was there. Her face was inches from his own. That sickening, too wide smile. Those hollow, bottomless eyes. The screen glitched. The static swelled, an ear-piercing screech ripping through the apartment. David clamped his hands over his ears, his vision blurring as the television flashed images too fast to process. A hallway. A door. A dark, endless corridor. A figure in the distance. Her face, too close, too sharp, too wrong. A single, rasping whisper through the distortion. Come closer. Then, darkness. David woke up on the floor. His head ached. His limbs felt leaden. The apartment was silent. No static. No whispers. No woman. His body trembled as he pushed himself up, glancing around. His phone was beside him, screen cracked, still open to the last message. Unknown number, it's inside now. David sucked in a sharp breath. His entire apartment felt different. Wrong. The air was stale, heavy. The lights seemed dimmer, like the bulbs had lost their warmth. The TV was off. But something about it made his skin crawl. The longer he stared, the more uneasy he felt, like if he turned away for too long, it would flicker back on by itself. He forced himself to stand. His legs felt weak, unsteady, like he hadn't moved in hours. Had he blacked out? His mind raced. He had to do something. Had to break this. There was only one place to go. The station. David hadn't driven in days. Now, he gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded in reality. The streets were empty, abandoned under the cold glow of flickering streetlights. He was heading toward the broadcast station. The one that had no record of ever airing Channel 13. It was an old building, half forgotten on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that still had antennas clawing at the sky, relics from an era of ghost signals and dead air. He didn't know why he was going. But something pulled him there. Like the station was waiting. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The front doors had been unlocked. No security, no front desk. Just a hollow, abandoned space filled with the hum of unseen machines. David moved through the darkness, his footsteps echoing against the tile. Then he saw it. A single active broadcast room. A red light flickered above the doorway. On air. His stomach twisted. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was small. Cramped. Filled with outdated equipment and old monitors stacked in a corner, their screens cracked and blackened with age. But the main screen, the only working one, was playing a live feed. David's blood ran cold. It was his apartment. The same broadcast. But something was different. There was someone standing in the middle of his living room. David's breath hitched. His own body was on the screen, still lying on the floor, unmoving. But that thing, that figure, was watching him. Not the him on the screen. The real him. David could feel it. The moment his eyes met the screen, the figure's head snapped upward. Like it had sensed him. The static roared. The speakers screamed with an ear-splitting burst of distortion. The monitors flickered, flashing glimpses of the woman's face, her wide, grinning mouth, her endless, black eyes. David staggered back. His chest clenched as the room rumbled. The machines hissed. The static swelled to a deafening roar. Then, the screen changed. And what David saw made his stomach drop. It wasn't his apartment anymore. It was the room he was standing in. A live feed of the broadcast room. And right behind him, the woman. Her face filled the screen, her mouth unhinged. And in the distortion, the whisper came again, clearer this time. You brought me back. The door behind him slammed shut. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. David's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The only light came from the flickering screen in front of him, the live feed of the broadcast room. And standing right behind him, reflected in the monitor, was her. The woman. Her hollow eyes bore into him, her mouth stretching into a grotesque, too-wide grin. Her body twitched unnaturally, her head tilting at a sharp, unnatural angle. David whipped around. Nothing. Just cold, suffocating air pressing in from all sides. But he knew better. She was here. Somewhere in the dark, waiting. His hands fumbled against the console, searching for something, anything, to stop the broadcast. If this was the source, if this was where the signal had been coming from, he had to end it. The screens flickered, distorting, images flashing too fast to comprehend. A hallway. A door. His apartment. And then, the closet. The door in the footage slowly creaked open. David's stomach twisted. Something crawled out. Not the woman. Something worse. It was all wrong. A shadow stretching and contorting, its limbs jerking as if learning how to move. The thing had no face, no eyes, just a gaping, twisting void where a mouth should be. And yet, David knew, it could see him. A whisper slithered through the static. "You left the door open?" David's blood turned to ice. His closet. That night. The night he had slammed it shut, thinking it was over. But it hadn't been over. He had let something in. And now, it was free. The broadcast controls. David's fingers scrambled over the controls. His pulse pounded in his ears. Shut it down. Shut it down. The dials were rusted, knobs unresponsive. Static hissed from the speakers, whispering his name over and over. The screen glitched. And then, the feed changed again. It was still his apartment. But he was there, sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, frozen in place. David's stomach lurched. He wasn't in his apartment. He was here. In the station. So who was that? The figure in the footage turned its head. David felt his breath hitch. It had his face. But it wasn't him. The thing in the footage smiled. His smile, but warped. Stretched. It leaned forward, placing a single, skeletal finger against its lips. David's vision blurred. His body felt wrong. Like something was pressing down on him, forcing him to stay still. The static grew louder. The screen flashed, rapid, erratic images of things David couldn't understand. A door in a place that shouldn't exist. An endless hallway lined with TV screens, all playing his life. And then, a final message, appearing in blood-red text on the screen. "Welcome home." The TV shut off. And the door behind him unlocked. Escape, or something like it. David ran. He didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to breathe. The station hallways twisted, the exits seeming further and further away with each step. The walls pulsed, shadows shifting in the corners of his vision. A voice whispered through the speakers. "Fit, stay." David burst through the exit doors, nearly stumbling onto the pavement outside. The night air hit him like a wave of ice. Turned. The station was dark. Silent. Like it had never been broadcasting at all. His phone buzzed. David's hands trembled as he pulled it out, staring at the notification. "Unknown number, see you soon." His stomach dropped. The phone screen glitched, for just a second, barely noticeable. The reflection in the screen smiled back at him. And it wasn't his. The final broadcast. David never turned his TV on again. He tried to move on. Tried to convince himself it had all been some kind of hallucination, a fever dream. But deep down he knew the truth. The broadcast hadn't stopped. It had just found a new channel. And late at night, when the world was quiet, when the static in the air seemed just a little louder, he swore he could still hear it. The whispers. The laughter. And somewhere, in the dark, a television flickered on. Waiting. For its next viewer.